That day, I was sitting in the park opening my sandwich box, noticing a frail, homeless old man with weary eyes. I tore my sandwich in half and offered him one part. He quietly accepted it, then unexpectedly handed me a piece of paper with a phone number written on it, saying only, "Call me when you truly need a way out." A few days later, I decided to call him and arranged a meeting. In a quiet cafe, he was already waiting, his gaze steady and resolute. He looked straight at me and said, "I know they've taken everything from you. Work with me. We'll make those people pay and take back what you've lost." In that moment, I realized that the opportunity to seek justice for myself and my newborn child had arrived. My name is Darren Banner. To help you understand why I'm sitting here facing a mysterious old man with piercing eyes and a haunting promise, I need to tell you my story from the beginning. From my earliest days, from the impoverished streets where I grew up with dreams bigger than the leaky rooftops. I was born in a working-class neighborhood in the Bronx, New York, where the smell of machine oil and the sound of truck horns blended into an endless soundtrack of life. Our small house was tucked away on a narrow street, with stained walls and a roof that leaked every time it rained. My father, Tom Banner, was a handyman. He had rough, calloused hands, yet they were remarkably skilled when wielding a hammer or wrench. My mother, Dorothy, worked 2 jobs to keep our family from falling into destitution. By day, she taught part-time at a nearby elementary school, and by night, she stood behind the counter at a small diner where the smell of grease and the clatter of dishes never ceased. Our home was cramped with just a small living room, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms where the wind whistled through the cracks every winter. But despite the poverty, that house was always filled with love. I still remember the evenings when my father sat in his worn-out armchair, telling stories of his youth while my mother softly sang the songs she'd learned from her grandmother. They didn't have much, but they had me and I had them. That was all we needed. From a young age, I realized the harshness of the world outside. Once I accompanied my father to a mansion in an upscale neighborhood to fix some plumbing. The homeowner, a man in a glossy suit, looked at my father as if he were a stain on an expensive rug. He bared my father for being slow, even though my father had been working tirelessly for hours. I stood there, an 8-year-old boy, clenching my fists, feeling the blood rush to my face. My father just bowed his head silently and kept working. But as we left, he took my hand and said, "Darren, as long as you stay honest and work hard, being poor is not a shame. Don't let them make you feel inferior." Those words etched themselves into my mind. My mother often echoed similar sentiments, especially when she came home with aching feet after a night shift. "My dear boy," she'd say, her tired eyes still shining. "Education is the key. Study hard, and you'll have a chance to change your life, not just for you, but for us, too." I listened and absorbed her words. I knew I didn't want my parents to have to bow to anyone anymore. I wanted them to live a more comfortable life, free from worrying about every penny for medicine or electricity bills. I threw myself into my studies like a parched man, searching for a stream. At school, I was always at the top of my class, even though I wore hand-me-down clothes my mother patched up from my cousin's old things. I didn't care when the rich kids mocked my worn-out shoes or tattered backpack. I buried myself in books, math problems, and literature, believing it was the only way to escape poverty. Every night, I studied under the dim light of a weak desk lamp while my mother sat beside me, checking my homework with a proud smile. My father would bring home old books discarded by his clients, stacking them in a corner of my room. "Knowledge is something no one can take from you," he said. But life was never just full of beautiful dreams. I remember when I was 13, my mother fell seriously ill. She had to take a week off work, and our meager savings quickly ran dry. My father worked day and night, but it still wasn't enough to afford her medicine. I secretly went to a nearby grocery store to ask for a job. The store owner, a stern man, looked me up and down and sneered. "A poor kid like you. What do you think you can do?" I didn't answer, just bowed my head and left. But that night, when my mother hugged me and promised she'd get better, I made a vow to myself. I would never let anyone look down on my family again. I would work. I would study. And one day, I would make them see us differently. When I was 16, I earned a scholarship to a prestigious high school in another part of town. It was my first step into a completely foreign world where kids drove their own cars to school, wore expensive uniforms, and talked about vacations in Europe as if they were everyday occurrences. I felt out of place like a fish flung onto dry land. But I didn't let myself falter. I studied day and night, proving myself step by step. Those efforts earned me a university scholarship. College was even more challenging, but I persevered and eventually graduated with a degree in finance from a prestigious institution. The day I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, my parents sat in the back row. My mother sobbed uncontrollably and my father gripped my hand tightly, saying only, "You are our greatest pride." After graduation, I began my job search. Armed with an honors degree from a prestigious university, I was confident I would soon find my place. I sent applications to dozens of companies, from small banks to large corporations. But the job market was harsher than I had imagined. Rejection letters came one after another, each one like a punch to my dreams. Once a recruiter looked me up and down, his scrutinizing gaze lingering on the old dress shirt I had borrowed from a friend. "Where are you from?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "The Bronx," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave a faint smile and said, "Thank you. We'll be in touch." But I knew they would never call. Then, by some stroke of luck, an opportunity came my way. Sterling Group, a renowned multidisciplinary financial and investment conglomerate, accepted my application. I still remember the day of the interview, my heart pounding as I stepped into their towering Manhattan skyscraper with its gleaming glass walls and polished marble floors. I felt small, like an outsider lost among expensive suits and conversations filled with high-level financial jargon. But when I sat before the interview panel, I summoned all my courage, answering each question with the confidence honed through years of relentless study. They nodded, took notes, and in the end, I was hired into the investment analysis department. The starting salary wasn't high, but for a kid from the Bronx, it was a life-changing milestone. My early days at Sterling Group were intense. I worked like a machine. I arrived early, stayed late, checked every number, analyzed every report, and let no mistake slip through. I wanted to prove I belonged, that my roots in the slums didn't define me. Gradually, my colleagues began to notice me. They called me the hard-working kid, and some even asked me to review their reports. I felt proud, but I couldn't ignore the reality. At Sterling Group, I was always an outsider. Class prejudice was as clear as daylight. Colleagues born into wealthy families educated at Ivy League schools were treated differently. They lunched at upscale restaurants, talked about vacations in the Hamptons or their family yachts. Meanwhile, I brought lunch prepared by my mother, ate quickly in the break room, and tried to ignore the curious glances or whispers behind my back. Once a colleague named Mark, the son of a bank executive, looked at me and smirked. "From the Bronx, huh? How'd you even get in here? Must be luck." I smiled, swallowing my anger, and kept working. I knew that to survive here, I couldn't let emotions overpower reason. Still, the job at Sterling Group truly transformed my life. I rented a small apartment near the office for convenience, and with a steady salary, I began sending money home to my parents regularly. I still remember the first time I brought a new TV to our little house in the Bronx. My mother's eyes lit up as she looked at it, though she playfully scolded me. "Darren, you don't need to buy these things. As long as you're healthy and doing well, I'm happy. My father just patted my shoulder, saying nothing, but his eyes were filled with pride. I also helped pay for my mother's medicine and fixed the leaky roof. For the first time in years, I saw my parents smile more often. Those moments made every ounce of exhaustion and every condescending glance at work worth it. I began to climb the ranks. From an analyst, I was entrusted with more significant projects and joined meetings with major clients. My boss, Mr. Harris, a stern but fair, middle-aged man, once called me into his office and said, "Darren, you've got what it takes. Don't let anyone hold you back." His words were like a shot of adrenaline. I worked harder, learned constantly, and gradually became a key player on the team. Colleagues started to respect me, no longer calling me the kid from the Bronx. But not everyone looked at me with kindness. The two sons of the company's chairman, Roy Sterling and Bill Sterling, made it clear that class prejudice would never fade. Roy, the elder, was an arrogant man with slick back hair and a voice dripping with condescension. Bill, the younger brother, was lazy, constantly relying on the family name to mask his lack of competence. Both looked at me as if I didn't belong in their world. Once during a team meeting, Roy deliberately asked about my background in front of everyone. "Darren, I heard you grew up in the slums, right? How does someone like you end up at Sterling Group?" The room fell silent, all eyes on me. I smiled calmly and replied, "I got here through ability, Mr. Roy. How about you?" A few colleagues chuckled, but Roy didn't. From that moment, I knew I had become a thorn in his side. Still, I didn't let it bother me. I kept working, visiting my parents on weekends, bringing groceries and stories about my job. My mother would hug me, saying she prayed every day for my safety. My father would retell old stories as if to remind me that no matter how far I went, I was still the boy from the Bronx raised in a home full of love. But everything changed when I met Ava Sterling, the only daughter of the company's chairman, Gregory Sterling. It was at the company's 50th anniversary gala where Ava appeared in a simple green dress, standing out like a beacon of light. Among the polished suits and superficial smiles, I was standing in a corner of the room, holding a glass of orange juice, trying to blend into the unfamiliar atmosphere of the event. I wasn't used to such occasions where people laughed and talked about yachts and European vacations. But when Ava's eyes met mine, I felt a strange warmth. She walked over her, smiled gentle but devoid of arrogance. "You're Darren, right?" she asked her, voice clear like a bell. I nodded a bit flustered, not expecting the chairman's daughter to know my name. We started talking. Ava asked about my work, the financial analyses I was doing, and I was surprised by the sincerity in how she listened. She wasn't like the rest of the Sterling family. No trace of Roy's arrogance or Bill's laziness. She was intelligent, sharp, yet full of emotion, as if she understood the struggles I never spoke aloud. Our conversation lasted longer than I expected, and by the end of the gala, I realized I had smiled more in those few hours than I had in the entire past month. In the days that followed, Ava and I ran into each other more often, sometimes in the office hallways, sometimes in the cafeteria. She always found a way to strike up a conversation, and though I tried to keep my distance, I couldn't resist being drawn to her warmth. We started meeting outside work, sharing brief coffee breaks at a small cafe near the office. There, Ava spoke of her dream to escape the glamorous but stifling world of her family, while I shared stories about my parents and our cramped house in the Bronx. I began to see that Ava wasn't just the daughter of a powerful dynasty. She was a woman with a free spirit, yearning to live authentically. Love came like a breeze, gentle yet powerful. I don't know the exact moment I fell for Ava, but it might have been the time she grabbed my hand during a sudden downpour as we ran for cover. She laughed loudly, her hair soaked, and said, "Darren, I love moments like this. No need to pretend, just being ourselves." In that moment, I knew my heart belonged to her. But I also knew this love wouldn't be easy. Ava was Gregory, Sterling's daughter, and I was just a guy from the slums. No matter how hard I worked, I could never erase the divide between our worlds. Rumors about us spread quickly through the company. The curious glances and whispers behind my back grew more frequent. Roy and Bill, in particular, didn't hide their contempt. Once Roy cornered me in a hallway, his voice icy. "Who do you think you are, Darren? A slum kid dreaming of my sister? Don't make me teach you your place." I clenched my fists, struggling to stay calm. But inside, a storm was brewing. Then my worst fear came true. One afternoon, Ava called me to a park near the office, her eyes red but resolute. "Father knows about us," she said, her voice trembling. "He said if I don't end things with you, he'll fire you. Not only that, he threatened to cut off all my financial support." My blood ran cold. I knew Gregory Sterling was a powerful man who wouldn't hesitate to use any means to protect his family's reputation. But when I looked into Ava's eyes, I saw her determination. "I'm not afraid, and I don't care what they do. I love you, and I want to be with you." Her words melted my heart, but also filled me with fear. I didn't want Ava to lose everything because of me. I had seen my parents live a lifetime in poverty, and I didn't want Ava to endure that. But she gripped my hand tighter than ever and said, "We'll get through this together, Darren. I believe in you." In that moment, I knew I couldn't turn back. I loved Ava, and I would fight to keep her by my side, even if it meant facing the world. We decided to get married despite all objections. When I proposed, Ava hugged me, tears streaming down her face, but a radiant smile on her lips. "Having you is enough," she said. But the Sterling family didn't feel the same. Gregory summoned me to his office, a grand room adorned with expensive paintings and windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline. He sat behind his desk, his gaze cold and piercing. "Do you think you're worthy of my daughter, Darren?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. "You don't belong in this world. If you persist, I'll make sure you lose everything. Your job, your reputation, everything." I stood tall, meeting his eyes. "Sir, I love Ava, and I won't let anyone take her from me." 2 months later, we held our wedding in a small, simple, but warm church. Only a few close friends, my parents, and my relatives attended. My mother, in a modest but carefully chosen dress, hugged Ava and said, "You're the pride of our family. Take care of my boy, okay?" Ava burst into tears, embracing my mother tightly. My father patted my shoulder, his eyes full of pride, but tinged with worry. Not a single member of the Sterling family showed up. No blessings, no glances. They saw our marriage as a stain, a disgrace to the family, as Roy had once shouted in my face. After the wedding, Ava and I moved into a small apartment in the suburbs. It wasn't luxurious, but it was our home. Every night, as Ava lay in my arms, I felt like the happiest man alive. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. Gregory Sterling wasn't the kind of man to let things go easily. The storm hit just a few weeks after our wedding. One morning when I arrived at the office, Mr. Harris, the boss who had always supported me, called me into his office. He looked at me, his eyes heavy. "Darren," he said, his voice low, "you're fired. It's an order from above." I tried to intervene, but one can go against Gregory Sterling. I stood there feeling as if the floor beneath me had collapsed. I wasn't surprised. I had anticipated Gregory's retaliation, but the sensation of having the job I had poured my sweat and tears into ripped away still cut like a knife through my heart. I returned to our apartment, trying to keep a calm expression so as not to worry Ava. But she knew. Ava always knew. She was sitting on the sofa, her eyes bright but filled with concern. "Darren, what's wrong? You're not okay. I can tell." I sighed, pulled her into my arms, and told her everything. She held my hand, gripping it so tightly I could feel the pulse of her heartbeat. "We'll get through this, Darren," she said, her voice resolute. "They can take your job, but they can't take our love." But the Sterling family wasn't done. Shortly after, Ava received a letter from her father. Gregory declared he was cutting off all financial support, bank accounts, credit cards, even her inheritance. "You chose a filthy pauper," the letter read, its tone as cold and sharp as a blade. "You will pay for your foolishness." Ava read the letter, her hands trembling, then tore it to pieces. "They're not my family," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You and your parents are my real family." I held her, trying to hide the fear gnawing at my heart. I threw myself into finding a new job, sending applications everywhere from small financial firms to large corporations. But every time the doors slammed shut in my face. One recruiter was blunt. "Darren, you have a strong resume, but no one dares hire you. You've crossed the Sterlings. They have more power than you realize." I slowly realized that Gregory and his family had used their influence to manipulate the system, blocking me from any decent job. We survived on Ava's meager savings and small loans from my parents. But with each passing day, our future grew dimmer. Amid those hardships, a spark of joy arrived unexpectedly. Ava was pregnant. When she told me in our tiny kitchen, it was as if the whole world lit up. I knelt down, hugged her, tears rolling down my cheeks. "We're having a baby. Thank God," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. She smiled, placing my hand on her belly. "A boy," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I want to name him Tony after my grandfather, the only person in my family who ever truly loved me." I nodded, feeling a surge of new strength. But that joy didn't last. As Ava entered her 8th month of pregnancy, she began to weaken. She was often exhausted, sometimes fainting without explanation. I took her to the hospital, my heart pounding with worry. The doctors said she had a rare but dangerous pregnancy complication. "We'll do everything we can," they said, but I saw the unease in their eyes. I held Ava's hand, trying to stay calm, but inside a storm was raging. I couldn't lose her. I just couldn't. The day Ava went into labor, I stayed by her side in the delivery room, gripping her hand, praying with every ounce of faith I had left. But then the doctor pulled me aside, his voice trembling. "Darren, we have a problem. Ava's condition is critical. We may only be able to save the mother or the child." The world seemed to collapse beneath me. "Save Ava," I nearly shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. "Save my wife, please." In a panic, I rushed back to the delivery room. Ava lay there, her face pale, her breathing faint. She seemed to sense something. She struggled to open her eyes, her trembling hand reaching for mine, whispering, "Darren, you have to save our baby. Promise me you'll protect Tony." I shook my head, tears falling like rain, unable to accept the thought of losing her. But Ava squeezed my hand tightly, her voice weak but resolute. "Let me do this for our child. You have to be strong for Tony." I collapsed beside her bed, sobbing like a child. Every second felt like a death sentence. Then the doctors made their final decision. Tony was born, a tiny but healthy boy with clear eyes just like his mother's. But Ava, the woman I loved more than life itself, was gone forever. I sat motionless, holding Tony in my arms, feeling my heart shatter. She had sacrificed everything to give our son life, and I, helpless, could do nothing to save her. Ava's funeral took place on a rainy day. I stood by her coffin, trying to keep myself from breaking down. My parents came standing silently beside me, my mother holding Tony and weeping. The Sterling family showed up, too, but not to mourn. Roy approached, his eyes full of contempt. "This is the result of your stupidity, Darren. That child is a stain, a filthy bloodline." Bill stood nearby, smirking. "You should get out of here before things get worse." Even Gregory, with his icy demeanor, looked at my parents and said, "Your family is a disgrace, raising a son who dared to taint the Sterling bloodline." My father bowed his head, holding my mother's hand, trying to stay calm. My mother clutched Tony tighter as if shielding him from those venomous words. I stood there, blood boiling but powerless to act. Deep within me a fire began to burn, not of hatred but of determination. I swore I wouldn't let the stirrings continue to trample on the people I loved. I would protect Tony, and I would make them pay for what they had done to Ava, to me, and to our family. After the funeral, I brought Tony back to my parents' small house in the Bronx. The apartment Ava and I had called our home was now just a painful memory. I couldn't afford to keep it, nor could I bear to face the walls that still held her warmth. My parents welcomed us without a word of reproach, only silent hugs and eyes filled with sorrow. My mother, with her frail hands, cradled Tony and sang to him in the same clear voice she used to sing to me when I was a child. My father quietly fixed up an old crib in the corner of the house, the one he had made for me 30 years ago. "Stay here, Darren," he said, his voice low but firm. "Family is for leaning on each other." But I knew I couldn't rely on my parents forever. They were getting old, their health declining, and their meager savings were barely enough for their medicine and living expenses. I had to stand up to find a way to provide for Tony and care for my parents. I began the job search again. I knew the Stirrings had used their influence to ensure I wouldn't find any decent-paying job in New York. So I turned to odd jobs, delivering packages, waiting tables, even working as a night security guard at a supermarket. Every day, I left home before the sun rose and returned when Tony was already asleep in my mother's arms. The little money I earned was just enough for Tony's formula and to cover the utility bills. Some nights I sat by his crib watching his tiny face and felt an indescribable pain. Tony had Ava's eyes bright, gentle, and full of life. Every time I looked into them, it was as if Ava were reminding me, "Be strong for Tony." My life became an endless cycle of exhaustion and disappointment. I worked 16 hours a day, but it was never enough to provide for my family. My mother started coughing more frequently, and my father, though he tried to hide it, couldn't conceal the back pain that plagued him whenever he tried to fix something around the house. I brought home money, but it disappeared quickly into medicine, diapers, and mounting bills. Once I had to sell the watch Ava had given me, a gift she bought with her last bit of savings before her family cut her off. As I handed the watch to the buyer, it felt like I was selling a piece of my heart, but I had no choice. Tony needed to eat, and my parents needed to live. In my weakest moments, I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. I had fought for love, defying all prejudice, but the cost was Ava's life. And now I was dragging my entire family into the storm. Some nights when Tony cried for milk, I couldn't afford to buy right away. I sat in the corner of the kitchen, my head buried on the table, feeling more helpless than ever. I missed Ava, her smile, the way she held my hand and said we would overcome everything. But now she was gone, and I was left with Tony, a tiny, innocent child who depended entirely on me. An inner conflict gnawed at me every day. I loved Tony, loved my parents, but I couldn't bear the feeling that I was failing them. I longed to give Tony a better life, to let my parents rest after years of hardship, but I didn't know where to begin. Once when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Dark circles under my eyes, disheveled hair, a gaunt face worn by exhaustion. I wondered, was this still the Darren that Ava loved? Was this still the man who swore to change his family's life? But amid that darkness, a faint spark still flickered. It was in my mother's smile, tired but warm as she held Tony. It was in my father, despite his back pain, telling me old stories to comfort me. And it was in Tony, only a few months old, grasping my finger and smiling, a pure smile, just like Ava's. Those moments reminded me of my parents' teachings, integrity and resilience. Darren, those are things no one can take from you. I knew I couldn't give up. I started seeking out small opportunities, anything that could help me get back on my feet. I took on extra night shifts, enrolled in free online courses to refresh my financial knowledge, hoping that one day I'd find a way out. I didn't know how to confront the Sterling family, but I knew I couldn't let them win. The vow I made, under the rain at Ava's funeral, still burned within me. And then one fateful evening, destiny knocked in a way I never expected. Through a mysterious old man, a crumpled piece of paper, and a promise that could change everything. I still remember that moment clearly on a dreary afternoon in the park. In my hand was a sandwich I had bought in haste. Seeing a homeless old man huddled on a bench, my stomach tightened. Without thinking much, I tore the sandwich in half and offered him a piece. He accepted it, his trembling hands contrasting with his startlingly sharp eyes as if they could see through my soul. Then silently he pulled out a piece of paper with a handwritten phone number. "Call me," he said, his voice low and enigmatic. "When you truly need a way out." I tucked the paper into my pocket, thinking it was just an odd gesture of gratitude. But when I returned home, exhausted after a night shift, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. A way out. Something I craved more than anything. That night, I sat in my parents' small kitchen, the dim yellow light casting shadows on the crumpled paper. Tony was fast asleep in the next room. My parents had gone to bed, but I knew my mother only slept in fits and starts to watch over Tony, while my father hid the back pain he felt while fixing our leaky roof. I couldn't let them keep living like this. Couldn't let Tony grow up in the same poverty I had. I picked up the phone, my fingers hesitating over the keys. Finally, I dialed the number, my heart pounding as if I were standing at a fateful crossroads. The phone rang a few times before a calm, deep voice answered. "I've been waiting for your call." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Darren," I said. "We met at the park. You told me to call when I needed a way out." The old man chuckled softly, a dry but not unkind sound. "Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 5th Street, 10 a.m. Don't be late." Then he hung up, leaving me with a flood of questions and an eerie feeling, as if I had just stepped into a game whose rules I didn't yet know. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe, an old place with worn wooden tables and the faint aroma of roasted coffee. The place was nearly empty with only a few scattered customers. The old man was already there, tucked in a corner, wearing a gray coat and a woolen cap pulled low over half his face. But his eyes, sharp and resolute, held my gaze. I sat down across from him, feeling as if I were entering a dangerous chess match. "Thank you for coming, Darren," he said, sliding a glass of water toward me. "I know you're at rock bottom, but I also know you're the only one who can do what I couldn't." I stared at him, my heart racing. "Who are you and why me?" The old man smiled, but it was a sad smile, heavy with memories. He slowly removed his cap, revealing a weathered face etched with deep wrinkles. "I am Arthur Sterling," he said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "The founder of Sterling Group and Ava's grandfather." It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Arthur Sterling, a name that existed only in distant company stories, a forgotten legend. Ava had spoken of him, the only person in her family who loved her unconditionally. "My grandfather was the best person I ever knew," she once said, her eyes sparkling. "But my father pushed him out of the family. I never imagined I'd meet him, let alone that he'd appear in my life at this moment." Arthur began to speak, his voice rising and falling like the pages of an old book being opened. He had built Sterling Group from nothing with a dream of creating a legacy for his family. But his son and daughter-in-law betrayed him. They tricked him into signing over his shares, slandered him, and forced him out of the company. "I lost everything, Darren," he said, his gaze distant. The company, my honor, my family. But I never stopped watching. I knew about you from your time at Sterling Group. I saw your integrity, the way you loved Ava, despite all prejudice. And when you lost her, I knew you were the only one with enough reason to take down Gregory. Arthur paused, then gave a faint smile. Our meeting in the park, it wasn't a coincidence. It was my way of reaching you. I sat, there trying to process his words. Why do you trust me? I asked, my voice with emotion. Arthur looked me straight in the eye. Because you have what the Sterling family lost. Resilience and a true heart. You didn't bow to Roy and Bill's insults. You fought for Ava, and now you're fighting for your son. I see. In you the fire I let die out. Then he slid a thick, worn folder across the table. I opened it, my hands trembling, my heart pounding as I scanned the pages. They were classified documents, evidence of Gregory embezzling money, setting up shell companies to launder funds, hiding debts, and manipulating stocks. There were records of suspicious accidents, a rival's sudden death, a journalist who vanished after investigating Sterling Group, in documents showing Gregory bribing officials and rigging politics to cover up scandals. A chill ran down my spine, not just at the scale of the crimes, but at the ruthlessness of the man I once called my father-in-law. Arthur explained that he had gathered these documents over years, living in hiding to avoid Gregory's pursuit. The journalists who investigated him all disappeared, he said, his voice lowering. I stayed silent because I knew I couldn't fight him alone. But you, Darren, you have the drive I lacked. You have Tony, and you have Ava's pain. I gripped the folder tightly, feeling as if it were burning in my hands. If I do this, I said, my voice trembling, what will I face? Arthur met my gaze unwavering. True darkness, Darren. Gregory isn't just greedy, he's a predator. He won't hesitate to destroy anyone in his way. But if you don't act, you and Tony will live under his shadow forever. Only by exposing him can your family have a future. I sat in silence, my mind reeling. I thought of Tony, the baby who lost his mother at birth. I thought of my parents who had sacrificed their lives for me. And I thought of Ava, her smile, her final promise, protect Tony. I knew I couldn't turn back. This wasn't just a chance to seek justice for Ava. It was a declaration of war against a dark empire. I looked at Arthur and nodded. I'll do it, I said, my voice steadier than ever. Arthur smiled, a smile filled with hope, but also caution. Good. But remember, Darren, this will be a long battle. Once you're in, there's no turning back. We must be careful, and we only have one chance. I left the cafe with the folder tucked tightly in my bag, feeling as if I were carrying a ticking time bomb. Arthur had warned me not to tell anyone, not even my parents, about what he had revealed. Gregory has eyes and ears everywhere, he said, his voice a low whisper. One wrong word, and both of us could disappear just like the others. I nodded, my heart heavy. I wasn't afraid for myself, but I feared for Tony, the baby growing up in my mother's arms, and for my parents, who had sacrificed their lives for me. I knew I had to be more careful than ever. Back home, I quietly hid the folder at the bottom of the wardrobe inside an old box Ava had used to keep the love letters we wrote to each other. Each time I opened it, her delicate handwriting hit me like a wave, and the pain threatened to overwhelm me. But now that pain no longer brought me to my knees. Instead, it fueled me. Arthur and I began meeting regularly, always in discreet locations, a secluded park, a small diner on the outskirts of town, or an old, rarely visited library. He taught me how to cover my tracks, how to communicate without leaving a trace. Gregory's no fool, he said during one meeting in the park as we sat on a wooden bench pretending to be strangers discussing the weather. He has an entire network, lawyers, officials, even people in law enforcement. If we act rashly, he'll crush us before we can even speak. I listened intently, absorbing every word. Arthur explained that the documents he had given me were only copies, internal records he had collected over years. They were enough to cause a stir, but lacked the legal weight to hold up in court. We need the originals, he said, his eyes sharp. And we need living witnesses, people who worked for Gregory, who saw his crimes firsthand. But they're scared, Darren. They know what happens to those who dare to stand against him. I thought about his words, about the journalists who disappeared, the suspicious accidents detailed in the folder. A chill ran down my spine, but I refused to let fear take over. So what do we do? I asked. Arthur leaned closer, his voice dropping. We strike from the shadows. Step by step, we'll undermine Gregory's credibility, make shareholders doubt him, turn public opinion against him. When the time is right, we'll deliver the decisive blow, the original evidence and witnesses. But first, we have to find them and convince them to stand with us. Arthur's strategy was far from simple. This wasn't a straightforward lawsuit. It was a long, grueling war requiring patience and cunning. I, a guy from the Bronx who had only ever known hard work and integrity, now had to learn to move in the shadows, conceal my intentions, and outwit an enemy 100 times more powerful than me. Arthur began guiding me into his world, a world of secret connections and meticulously calculated plans. He introduced me to a few people he called allies in the dark. There was a former accountant from Sterling Group who had worked under Gregory but was fired after uncovering shady transactions. Now living under an assumed name in the suburbs, he agreed to help us on the condition that his identity remained secret. There was a journalist who had investigated Sterling Group and narrowly escaped death in a sudden car accident. She now lived in hiding but still held on to critical documents she hadn't dared to publish. And there were others. Former employees betrayed business partners, each holding a piece of the truth. These meetings always took place in secret, often at night in places no one would suspect. I learned to vary my routes daily too. Check for tails. Each time I left the house, I kissed Tony's forehead as he slept soundly in his crib and whispered, "I'll do this, son, for your mom." My mother noticed the tension in my eyes, but didn't ask questions. She only hugged me, saying, "Be careful, Darren. I believe in you." My father was quieter, but I knew he worried for me. Arthur and I began building our plan. We couldn't sue Gregory yet, as he explained, because the evidence wasn't strong enough, and his powerful network would ensure any lawsuit was buried. To take down a predator, Arthur said, his eyes sharp, "You can't miss. We have one shot, and it has to hit the heart." I looked into the darkness ahead and told myself, this is only the beginning. During a strategy discussion in an old library, Arthur said, "We can't attack head-on. Gregory has too many allies. We have to strike from within, catch him off guard, and make him expose his own weaknesses." I nodded, gripping a book tightly. "So what's the first step?" Arthur gave a sharp, cold smile. "We leak a portion of the documents. Just enough to stir unease, but not enough for him to trace it back to us. The press will be our first weapon. They'll do part of the work for us, putting pressure on Sterling Group." That night, I returned home and held Tony in my arms. The baby slept soundly, his tiny lips pursed as if lost in a sweet dream. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "I'll do this, Tony. I'll give you the future your mother dreamed of." Then I sat down, opened my old laptop, and got to work. Arthur had provided me with an encrypted communication channel, a way to anonymously send information to a journalist he trusted, someone who had nearly lost their life investigating Sterling Group. I selected a document from the folder, an internal report about a shell company Gregory used for money laundering, along with a few notes about suspicious transactions. I didn't sign my name or leave any trace. When I hit send, my heart pounded as if I had just fired the first shot in a war. A few days later, I saw the results. A small article appeared in a reputable financial newspaper with the headline, Sterling Group. Is there something shady in their financial reports? The article didn't name Gregory directly, but it cited figures from the document I had sent, raising questions about the company's transparency. I read it in the corner of my parents' kitchen, feeling a surge of adrenaline. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer a victim. I was fighting back. But Sterling Group's response came faster than I expected. Gregory, backed by his formidable PR team, immediately held a press conference. I watched it on TV while my mother cradled Tony in the living room. Gregory, in an expensive suit, stood before the microphones, his voice as smooth as a seasoned politician's. "These allegations are baseless," he said, his eyes cold and piercing. "This is nothing but a ploy by competitors to undermine the confidence of our shareholders and clients. Sterling Group has always been transparent and committed to its values." Roy and Bill stood behind him, nodding like puppets, but I could see the tension in their eyes. Arthur called me right after, his voice excited but cautious through a secure line. "You did well, Darren," he said. "This is just the first stone thrown into the lake. The ripples will spread, but we must be patient. Don't let them trace it back to you." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "They won't find me," I said, my voice resolute. But deep down I knew danger was closing in. In the days that followed, the ripples began to spread. Smaller shareholders of Sterling Group, those outside Gregory's control, started asking questions. A few more articles appeared, digging deeper into the irregularities in the financial reports. The media began to take notice, and I saw Sterling Group's name in headlines with increasing frequency. Arthur and I stayed hidden, watching from afar, like shadows in the dark. Each time we met, I learned more about covering my tracks and sending information without leaving clues. But my life was still far from easy. I continued working odd jobs, racing against time to provide for Tony and my parents. Some nights after returning from a shift, I sat by Tony's crib, watching him sleep peacefully, and felt a creeping fear. I was taking on an empire, and if I failed, it wouldn't just be me who suffered. My entire family would pay the price. But then I thought of Ava. The way she held my hand and said we'd overcome everything. I remembered Arthur's words. "We only have one shot." And I told myself I couldn't stop. I continued leaking documents, small pieces at a time, like drops of water, overflowing a glass. A report about a secret loan, an internal email revealing Gregory's bribery of an official. Each document was a bullet fired from the shadows aimed at the heart of Sterling Group. I didn't know if Gregory suspected anything yet, but I could feel the tension in the air. Once, while passing a newsstand, I saw Roy on the front page with the headline, "Sterling Group Chairman's Son Suspected in Fraud." I stopped, my heart racing, and bought the paper. The article didn't mention me or Arthur, but I knew we were shaking their empire. Arthur and I met again in a small diner on the outskirts of town, where the dim lighting and sparse crowd ensured no one noticed two men sitting in the corner. He looked at me, his eyes a mix of pride and worry. "You're doing well," he said. "But from now on, things will get more dangerous. Gregory won't sit idly by." I nodded, my hands clenched. "I'm ready," I replied, though a formless fear still stirred within me. But I wouldn't stop until they paid for what they had done. As a series of articles continued to be published, the atmosphere at Sterling Group began to shift. I no longer worked there, but through the few old friends I had left, I heard whispers of unease within the company. Shareholders started raising questions at meetings, demanding explanations for the suspicious figures in the financial reports. Gregory, with his formidable team, tried to extinguish the flames with polished statements and lofty promises. But Arthur and I didn't stop. We knew the articles alone weren't enough. We needed a chain of relentless strikes, each one stronger than the last, to keep Sterling Group reeling. I began working with a small group of journalists Arthur trusted. They were people who had been threatened by Sterling Group, carrying both fear and determination in their hearts. One of them, Anna, had nearly lost her life in a car accident she believed Gregory had orchestrated. With her short silver-dead hair and resolute eyes, she became the leader in publishing our documents. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," she said when we met in a small Brooklyn apartment where she lived, under an assumed identity. "But Darren, you have to understand that once we do there's no turning back. Gregory will come after us." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know." Then one morning, I turned on the TV and saw Sterling Group's name plastered across every news channel. A major newspaper had released a series of investigative articles with the headline, "Sterling Group Scandal: Corruption and Cover-Ups at the Pinnacle of Power." The articles cited testimony from a former employee in the accounting department who had witnessed Gregory manipulating figures to hide debts. This was the person Arthur had convinced to come forward under the promise of anonymity. A media storm erupted. Articles sprang up like mushrooms after rain from financial journals to national news outlets. Each day brought new revelations. A shell company exposed a suspected bribe to an official, a partner pulling out of a deal with Sterling Group over scandal concerns. The company's stock price began to plummet, and I heard that major shareholders were holding secret meetings demanding answers from Gregory. On social media, the news spread like wildfire, with thousands sharing articles and questioning the company's transparency. Meanwhile, witnesses who had once stayed silent began to speak out. Another former accountant fired by Gregory for refusing to sign off on a falsified report contacted Anna and provided more evidence. A former business partner of Sterling Group, betrayed by Gregory in a deal, appeared on a television program publicly criticizing the company. And then something I hadn't expected happened. A journalist who had disappeared after investigating Sterling Group turned out to be alive. She appeared in an anonymous interview recounting how she had been threatened and forced to go into hiding. These stories, each a small piece of the puzzle, came together to form a clear picture of Gregory Sterling's greed and ruthlessness. The pressure from public opinion grew immense. Major partners of Sterling Group began canceling contracts, fearing association with the scandal. Panicked shareholders sold off their stocks, causing the company's market value to plummet. Arthur and I remained anonymous, letting the press do its work. Each time I saw Gregory's name on the news, I felt a small piece of justice being served. But I also knew we were entering the most dangerous phase. Gregory wouldn't sit idly by and watch his empire crumble. He would strike back. And when he did, Arthur and I had to be ready. In the days that followed, the news was dominated by reports about Sterling Group with increasingly sharp headlines. Sterling Group scandal. Is this the fall of an empire? Or Chairman Gregory Sterling faces pressure from shareholders and investigators? I sat in my parents' small kitchen, my eyes glued to the TV screen. I knew Gregory was hunting for the person behind the leaks. Once I received a message from an old friend at Sterling Group warning me that Roy and Bill were interrogating every employee and had even hired private investigators to trace the source of the documents. "Be careful, Darren," the message read. "They're furious." My heart raced as I read it. Then I deleted it immediately. I didn't respond, leaving no trace. The major shareholders of Sterling Group, once loyal to Gregory, began to waver. They no longer trusted his smooth promises or the polished speeches from his PR team. An extraordinary shareholders meeting was called, and this time it wasn't under Gregory's control. Arthur received word from an old ally on the board, a man who had worked with him in the early days of Sterling Group. "They're losing faith," he told me during a meeting in a small diner, his eyes gleaming with hope. "The shareholders want to act to save the company. This is our chance, Darren." We began preparing for the final blow. Arthur reached out to his allies, those betrayed by Gregory, to gather more original evidence. signed contracts, undeniable emails, and even recordings from a former assistant who had taped Gregory's secret meetings. I worked day and night reviewing every document, ensuring no mistakes. On the day of the shareholders' meeting, Arthur and I stayed away. We couldn't show our faces or let Gregory know we were behind it all. Instead, we sent the original documents to Anna. With a courage I couldn't help but admire, she passed them to a group of major shareholders and an investigative agency. As the meeting began, the atmosphere in Sterling Group's conference room was like a powder keg, ready to explode. I watched the meeting live through a secret link Anna provided. Gregory stood at the podium trying to maintain his composure, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The shareholders, usually silent and compliant, now stood up, confronting him with pointed questions. An older man representing a major investment fund held up a stack of documents, the very evidence we had sent. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice ringing through the silent room. "How do you explain these funds, the shell companies, the bribes recorded in your own emails?" The room erupted in whispers and stunned glances. Roy and Bill, seated beside their father, turned pale. Gregory tried to respond, his voice trembling but still laced with arrogance. "This is slander," he declared, losing his composure. "These documents are fabricated, spread by competitors to bring me down." But no one believed him anymore. Another shareholder stood and played a recording. Gregory's unmistakable voice, discussing a bribe to an official to cover up a scandal. The room fell silent, the only sound Gregory's ragged breathing through the microphone. Then something I hadn't anticipated happened. A major shareholder, once a close ally of Gregory, stood up and proposed a vote of no confidence. "We cannot let Sterling Group collapse because of one man's greed," he said. "I move to remove Gregory Sterling and his two sons from the board immediately." Applause broke out, loud and resolute. I felt a rush of adrenaline, unable to believe what was unfolding. Gregory tried to shout to regain control of the crowd, but no one listened anymore. The vote happened quickly and the results were announced. Gregory, Roy, and Bill were removed from the board. A temporary board was formed, pledging full cooperation with investigators to uncover every scandal. Gregory and his family were now under intense scrutiny. Investigative agencies swooped in, combing through every transaction, account, and email to trace the embezzlement, money laundering, and financial fraud we had exposed. I imagined Gregory's face, once arrogant and untouchable, now facing suspicious stares and unavoidable questions. In the days following the shareholders' meeting, the atmosphere in New York seemed to tremble with the storm we had unleashed. The press was relentless, churning out story after story. Meanwhile, Gregory, Roy, and Bill were summoned before investigative agencies, and I heard they had hired a team of high-priced lawyers to salvage their reputation. But this time, no one could cover up the truth. The evidence we provided, emails, forged contracts, recordings, was too clear, too sharp to be dismissed. Another shareholders' meeting for Sterling Group was scheduled, and this time, Arthur decided it was time for us to step forward. "This is our chance to close the past," he said, his voice low, but powerful. "I'll tell my story, and you'll tell yours. They need to know who's behind all this." I clenched my fists, feeling as if I stood at a fateful crossroads. The meeting took place in a grand Manhattan conference hall with gleaming glass walls and an atmosphere as tense as a courtroom. Arthur and I arrived early, standing in a corner, observing the crowd of shareholders, reporters, and members of the interim board. Gregory, Roy, and Bill were absent, under investigation, and barred from attending. As the meeting began, a few longtime shareholders immediately noticed Arthur, though he had left the company years ago, and his name seemed relegated to memory. The legend of Sterling Group's founder still lingered in whispers. Suddenly, A prominent shareholder stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the hall. Today, we are honored to have the presence of the man who founded Sterling Group. Many of you may never have met him, but he is a living legend among us. Please welcome Mr. Arthur Sterling to say a few words. Arthur walked to the podium with measured steps, an elderly man radiating dignity, his eyes sharp and his voice resonant. "I am Arthur Sterling," he declared, and the hall fell silent. A few people whispered, recognizing the legendary name of the man who founded Sterling Group. "I was betrayed by my own family, pushed out of the company I built by my son, Gregory Sterling. But today I return to tell the truth about his crimes, about the greed that has tarnished Sterling Group's legacy." He recounted his story, how he was tricked into signing away his shares, slandered and isolated. He spoke of his years in hiding, gathering evidence, waiting for the chance to reclaim justice. The hall was quiet, the only sound Arthur's powerful, emotional voice. Then he looked at me, his eyes signaling. "But I didn't do this alone," he said. "There is a young man who lost everything because of the Sterling family, yet still rose to fight. Darren Banner, please come forward." I stepped onto the podium, my heart pounding. All eyes were on me, and it felt like the world was watching. "I am Darren Banner," I said, my voice trembling at first, but growing steady. "I was once an employee of Sterling Group, humiliated by Gregory Sterling and his sons for my humble background. I loved Ava Sterling, and she sacrificed everything to give us our son Tony. But the Sterling family took her from me, took my job, and tried to take my son's future." I told my story about my love for Ava, the Sterling family's opposition and retaliation, her death, and the months I lived in despair. I spoke of our fight in the shadows, the documents Arthur and I had leaked, the witnesses who had come forward. "I didn't do this out of hatred," I said, looking directly at the crowd. "I did this for justice, for Ava, for my son, and for everyone the Sterling family has trampled." The hall erupted in applause. Tears streamed down my cheeks, not from sadness, but because for the first time, I felt I was no longer alone. The shareholders, once silent under Gregory's reign, now stood, voicing their support. The press captured every word, and I knew our story, Arthur's and mine, would spread far and wide. We were no longer shadows. We were victors. I knew that somewhere Gregory, Roy, and Bill were watching the meeting on a screen, and I imagined their faces, stunned, furious, realizing that the one who brought down their empire was me, Darren Banner, the Penniles pauper they once mocked. Arthur's honor was restored, and he was invited to rejoin the board as an honorary advisor, but he declined, looking at me with a proud smile. "You're the one who should lead, Darren," he said. "You have the heart and the ability Sterling Group needs." In a surprising decision, the board offered me a position on the new leadership team as CEO. I was stunned, unable to believe that I, a guy from the poor streets of the Bronx, had been recognized and seen. After my appointment, I moved my parents to a new home, not extravagant, but comfortable enough for them to live, without worrying about medical bills or a leaky roof. Tony, my little boy, began growing up in a loving environment with better care and nourishment. My mother still told him night stories every night, and in those moments, my heart was warmed beyond measure. Each morning when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw a broken man with dark circles under his eyes. Instead, I saw a father, a son, and a man who had fought relentlessly for justice. I had kept my promise to Ava, to Tony, and to myself. But more importantly, I wanted to send a message to everyone still struggling in the shadows. Hold fast to your integrity, stay resilient, and never give up. Justice may come late, but if you keep fighting, it will surely come. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.